This is going to be a breakdown of some of the sound design techniques I used in making this Mortal Kombat redesign from the Shao Khan gameplay trailer that I edited down. First, for the impact sounds, I tried to make as much distinction as possible between the spear, hammer, and then the punch and kick, although a lot of the elements are actually the same, just with different levels of processing on them. For the hammer sounds, I'm using this recording of bullets ricocheting on dirt as a kind of low thump layer, with Transient Master reducing the sustain to get rid of the dirt sounds so it's more like a kick. I'm layering that with the sound of a fruit being stabbed, which has a similar sound but just makes it sound thicker and more grounded when they're layered, so the lows and low mids are a bit less clean. I then have various recordings of hitting metal that I've made over time, using different ones to add to variety. They're being pitched down to sound bigger and the lows are being cut because they're deliberately a bit crowded as it is. I also have these resonances I got from hitting two knives together, pitched down and reversed to accentuate certain hits and add some tonality to make the sound stand out. For this project, I recorded myself crushing a load of vegetables like peppers and celery, and I'm also using them to add a tail to some of the more dramatic hits. I'm expanding these and pitching them down slightly to sound more crunchy and like bones cracking rather than a smaller pepper. As for processing on this whole stack, I'm pitching the whole thing down slightly just for a bit of added weight, Transient Master to cut down sustain a bit so it doesn't intrude on the magic ability sounds that it's cutting through, since they're being sidechained to them. I'm then using this distortion technique I found where I really dramatically boost the low ends on a shelf, then distort it. I don't even have to distort it that much. I'm using a little radiator because I love how subtly crunchy it makes sounds, and with this method you don't need to push it very hard. I'm then layering a low sine wave at around 50 Hz to give these really crunchy high mids, which is the kind of thing I was hearing in Doom Eternal's punch sounds, which really inspired this project. After some EQ to remove the sine fundamental because I only want the overtones, and clean up the frequencies generally, I'm using TDR Nova, which is a free dynamic EQ to duck the lows after 30 milliseconds, so that you get a nice powerful low transient but it doesn't linger in the lows and cause for hearing fatigue. For the punch and kick sounds, I'm using similar sound palette with a similar processing chain, but this time I'm layering some cloth hits I recorded by just punching a shirt to make it clear that the contact is being made with the character's clothes rather than a metallic weapon. I'm using the same low boost distortion technique, but this time the sine is a bit higher pitched to sound less heavy, and there's less drive on the little radiator to show that it's less powerful. Similarly, for the spear hits, I have the same chain but with even less distortion because it's not a transient based hit, so it doesn't work quite as well. The main element here is the sound of kind of scraping two knives together and having those being reversed into by the same resonances I have from hitting them together, layered with more wet, gory sounds from the vegetable recording session rather than bone breaks. For all the fantasy magic type sounds I have for both characters, I'm using an effects rack that I've explained fully in another video, which I'll link in the description. So watch that now if you want a detailed explanation of all the things going on here. I experimented using Quanta, which is a granular synth, and running recordings of kind of transient heavy textural things like rocks moving or kind of shattering glass, then making these sweeps in the synth where I map the grain amount to the envelope so that it rises in intensity and drops, which gets the best results from this effect rack, especially with the vocoders. I also use stuff like animal vocalizations for more tonal sounds out of the rack, and Serum's oscillators for some more rumbly general stuff. After getting around 200 individual sounds from just playing around with the source material and parameters, I bounced out all the results as one big audio file and brought it into my other Ableton project to use as a palette because it's really heavy on the CPU, and construct my overall sounds out of these little parts. Firstly, I wanted Shao Khan's magic to be more kind of dirty and rough and sinister, like reality is being ripped apart when he uses it. So I used a more crunchy, low, mid, lows based palette for him. I used the same few tracks for all his abilities and just put different things at different points on the timeline so that I could experiment with different types of distortion or EQ on each track to both make sure that only one thing was inhabiting the subs and the lows at one time, and also make sure that the whole thing sounded like it's coming from the same source. As well as that, I have some more metal resonances with some Valhalla Supermassive to make them sound a bit more abstract, unlike the very close and grounded hammer impacts. I'm also using some kicks that I've just made over the years that all the other elements are sidechained to with Track Spacer to give more clean, punchy impacts that the original palette just doesn't have. And the overall processing for the whole group of these sounds is multi-band dynamics to control the lows and make sure they aren't constantly present to make them more powerful and noticeable when they are there. Then bringing up more highs and mids in the tails, because in the original palette there isn't a whole lot of highs. Next is Transient Master to increase the attack and sustain, basically just making it more punchy and dangerous and present. Then Crush, which is a free digital distortion, which I think really sells the destructive, dangerous power of these sounds and even further fills out the highs. Solid Bus Comp is pretty heavily compressing the sound to make it kind of more over the top, as well as bringing out all the distortion harmonics I just added. Finally, some EQ to reduce any super low unnecessary rumble and accentuate the highs even more, as well as slightly ducking the high mids, as most of the Foley tends to be in that frequency range. Raiden's magic uses similar techniques, but the tone is different to create distinction between the characters to make sure you can tell them apart with your eyes closed. I wanted his lightning to be very wet and clean and more bright because he's more of a protagonist character, whereas Shao Khan is kind of looks and feels very evil, I think. I'm layering these thunder recordings with all of his attacks to create a kind of noise layer that separates them even more, and also give it a kind of tail that the original palette for these kind of wetter sounds doesn't have as much. On top of that, I'm adding this tonal layer made from a metal resonance with a bit of tremolo and reverb to create even more distinction and let you know that he's using an ability because it's the same tone every time. My mastered processing chain for Raiden's magic has Supercharger to heavily compress and distort them, Multiband Dynamics and Transient Master for the same reasons as the other magic, and NC17 for a kind of different tone of distortion just to make absolutely sure they sound super different, and then more EQ doing the same thing as last time. For the really cinematic bone-breaking sounds at the start and end of the clip, I'm using a combination of the peppers breaking, celery, and occasionally some recordings of like a frozen lake cracking, because they have a nicer high end that I don't need to pitch down, because as I'm pitching down the vegetable recordings, they're losing those high frequencies. For the face smash at the end, I'm panning all of these kind of gory elements very slightly to accentuate how zoomed in and over the top it is. On the master stack, I have Transient Master to reduce those harsh random pops in the recordings and make them a bit more uniform. Kilohertz Pitch Shifter just to increase the scale a bit more without having to actually stretch out the clips. Supercharger just for a tiny bit of distortion, no actual compression. And two expanders, one more subtle than the other, to get rid of the more quiet, squelchy parts that don't fit with the visuals and to make them stand out against the more constant, lower, low mids magic sounds. Lastly, multiband dynamics just to do more expansion, but only on the highs this time because they're particularly egregious, I think. I'm also compressing the magic and bone crunching sounds together so that they sound like the same sound rather than two very different things that I've just stacked on top of each other. To make the mix more focused, I'm using Track Spacer a lot, almost emulating the priority system in a middleware to make the game more readable. The Foley group is sidechained to the magic attacks, and in turn the magic attacks are sidechained to the impacts. Then the background ambience is sidechained to everything, so it just fills up the space between the events. On my master channel, I have G mono bass, just to make sure everything under 100 Hz is mono, so it's easier to make out. Then kilohertz limiter, just to protect my ears when I'm designing sounds. The idea is not to actually hit the threshold on the limiter, but it just keeps extreme peaks from cutting through when I'm experimenting with things like distortion. Next is ozone elements, doing some final subtle EQ just to cut the rumble, boost some of the highs, and I'm using the maximizer to tame the transient slightly, just so I can have less kind of sudden peaks in the waveform, and so that the attack Foley stands out a bit more and gives the attacks a nice pre-life, which makes them a bit more grounded. Finally, I have a bit more softer compression with a slower attack and release, mainly just to bring up the ambience and quieter Foley in between the louder, more punchy attacks, to make the signal level over the whole piece more uniform so it doesn't have any weird jumps in volume. And then I have Yulin loudness meter on last, just to check the loudness over time and make sure the clip stays at a relatively stable level. And that's going to be it for breaking down this redesign. Thank you for watching.